first slide here that this picture was taken a couple of years ago in Memphis when we were doing peak season support for FedEx. As you know, during Christmas time, everyone likes to send each other presents or order presents for themselves. But in this particular picture, I thought it was nice because on the left-hand side is a classic 747, and that is probably the last classic 747 to fly for a U.S. airline. There's still a couple of them flying around the world. Every now and then we cross paths with one. This one in particular is in fact flying for, I think, a cargo company out of Georgia. I could be wrong about that, but anyway, I just thought the cool little fact that they were retired about 2 years ago. So that was the last one. So I grew up in a small town east of Los Angeles called Moreno Valley, which is just out kind of in the desert. Not really anything interesting out there, but I did grow up next to an Air Force base, March Air Force Base, which is kind of right around here, just below the dot there. So very cool to see. It was mostly tankers, KC-135s and KC-10s, but also some cargo planes like the C-141 and the C-5. Also, I had family in the Los Angeles area, so I got to spend some of my youth going and watching planes at LAX, which is now kind of like my favorite airport to fly into, just because it has that connection to my childhood and growing up loving airplanes and getting to see them there. So anytime my crews, anytime we're flying into LA, usually, unless one of the co-pilots needs the landing, I'll say, hey guys, I want to fly this leg, because it just has that sentimental value to me to do the landing in Los Angeles. But my grandfather was a pilot. He flew corporate. He had also flown in World War II. He flew P-38s, although he didn't see combat. My dad was sort of aviation industry adjacent. He worked for engineering electronics companies that did contract work, mostly for the Department of Defense, so like military stuff. But I guess my childhood was there's always lots of airplane books in the house. Obviously, Top Gun and The Right Stuff were two of my favorite movies of all time growing up. So in 1998, my family moved up to the Bay Area, and after doing a little bit of community college, I found this flight school in Oakland, California, at the Oakland airport, called Sierra Academy of Aeronautics, which was for many years a sort of airline career-oriented training facility, much like ATP is now. I don't know if you guys know much about ATP, but it's basically like almost like a farm school for getting guys from zero or private to CFI in hopefully the minimal amount of time. And that's kind of how I did it, although I never got my CFI, which I'll get into that on the next slide. But yeah, zero to commercial multi in less than 2 years, which is, I think, slightly above average for most, but there was a lot of guys that I was in flight school with that did it even faster. So, but the interesting thing is that right at the end, right before I took my commercial single engine check ride, September 11th happened, which kind of threw a big wrench in aviation generally. But a couple of weeks after September 11th, I got my commercial my commercial single license, and then in October of that year, I got my commercial multi license. So while I was in flight school, I was working at the local FBO, which, if any of you guys aren't aware, is a great resource for making connections. First of all, just being around airplanes, but making connections in the industry and finding ways to weasel your way into the right seat, or maybe even the left seat of all sorts of interesting airplanes. But when I was working at the FBO, this was shortly after I got my commercial multi, and I was beginning to start work on my CFI. This Duchess, I don't know if it was this exact tail number, but it was either this one or one very similar to it, came in, and you see it has this odd little antenna sticking off the back. So the pilot came in, and I asked him about it, and he said, "Oh, we do aerial mapping for cable television companies." I was like, "Oh," and he kind of explained that to me, what they did. And so I asked him, what are your minimums for hiring? And he said, "Well, do you have your commercial multi?" I said, "Yes, I do." He's like, "Oh, send me your resume." So I did, and several months later, they called me for a job interview, which at the time the company was headquartered up in Seattle, and they offered me a job shortly thereafter. And so this particular airplane, this Duchess 6014 Quebec, this was the very first airplane that I was ever paid to fly. And I flew it from a little airport in Valparaiso, Indiana, which is just south of Chicago, to Cincinnati. And it was really, really thrilling to be paid to fly a multi-engine airplane. And really, that's the reason I didn't continue with my CFI, because I had a flying job, and it sounded a lot more interesting than bouncing around the pattern with this student. But I will say, do not necessarily follow my advice or career, because I think a CFI is an extremely, extremely valuable ticket to have. And the guys that do have their flight instructor ratings, they are a lot smarter than me when it comes to, well, a lot of things. So it's a very, very valuable thing to have.
For you.
Oh yeah, is there a question?
Right. So going back to your previous slide, I see where the first job was aerial mapping.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure if I missed it, but could you go into just like a brief synopsis of what aerial mapping is, and how you go about doing it, and what purposes you do aerial mapping for?
Yeah, so I mean, this is really, really boring stuff, but I'll try and make it as succinct as possible before anyone falls asleep. At the time, I don't know if this is still the case, but at the time, and for many years, the FCC, which is the sort of the governing body of radio and television and communications in America, had a requirement that cable television companies prove that they had their signal leakage within a certain tolerance, which basically is because the coaxial cable that you would plug into a cable box or the back of your TV operates on the same frequencies as aviation communication and navigation. So they had to provide an annual report to the FCC that their cable television system, which would cover, whatever the size of the city is, wasn't leaking a signal into the atmosphere that could interfere with aviation. And that basically just comes down to whether the wire insulation is maintained across the system. But obviously, when you get into big towns, big cities, you're talking thousands and thousands of miles of wire over many hundreds of square miles footprint. So the fastest way to measure that would be with an airplane. I mean, you can do it in the street with a truck, but what would take a truck months, you could do it in an airplane in less than a day. And so that was the whole reason that this business existed. We went all over the country, including Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico. I didn't go to Puerto Rico or Hawaii. I did get to fly this airplane, which a very a much younger version of myself is standing in front of in this picture. It's a turbo Centurion Cessna 210. I got to take that all the way up to Barrow, Alaska, which is the northernmost American settlement inside the Arctic Circle, right on the Arctic Ocean. It was pretty cool. But we got to fly to everywhere and see a lot of the country. Good experience, and just in terms of getting a variety of flying in general aviation. And we were always two pilots in the airplane. We just alternate flying legs. And so going back to the actual system that we were, the kind of flying that we were doing is GPS grid flying, which is basically using the GPS, which at the time was a very primitive unit, didn't even have a moving map. Like you're literally using latitudes and longitudes and setting up a course for the GPS to provide for you, much like a VOR radial, except instead of coming from a point, it's just based off of a certain latitude and longitude, and you could move it over in half-mile or mile increments. I can't remember exactly what they were, but we basically just fly back and forth in these parallel lines to cover the footprint of the cable system we were flying over. So it could be as simple as, like a really small town takes 2 passes, or I did New York City one time and it took me 6 hours or something like that. It took forever. And that was in the middle of the night because obviously there's a lot of air traffic. That was the other thing we had to compete with was, busy airspace and busy cities.
That was gonna be my follow-up question about basically traffic and how were you able to avoid traffic? I guess flying in off-peak hours is one way.
Anytime we flew near major international airports, like guaranteed we had to do it in the middle of the night because the air traffic controllers just would not accommodate us flying, across their approach corridor or the departure corridor at, just doing this GPS grid back and forth at 2,000 feet. And also military airspace too. There was a lot of cable systems that went into military airspace, so we'd have to be on the phone when we're on the ground. And this is how long ago this was. We had to fax over maps of the areas that we were going to fly into. It'd be much easier now. Just send a PDF via email or something like that. But that was the nature of that job. It was hard work, but it was a lot of fun. It didn't pay very well, but I think for most of us at that stage in your flying career, your first flying job, you're just happy to be getting paid to build time, and that was certainly the case with us. So is there any other questions about this particular job?
No, I'm good. Is there anybody in the chat or anybody who is on right now who would have a question? You can feel free to unmute your mic and ask. Nope, nothing so far.
All right. Well, I forgot there was this slide here. This was when we were flying in Alaska. We had come from the East Coast, or sorry, the West Coast of Alaska back into Anchorage, and we got on the ground and I got out of the airplane. There's that big mess on the side of the airplane. The 210 had just a sort of a plunger style dipstick. A lot of GA airplanes have like a screw in, lockdown style of dipstick, but this one, you just literally, it was on the side of the engine. You pulled it out and pushed it back in, but it had like a sort of a notch that you wanted to make sure you push it in. That was kind of the locking notch to keep oil from, or to keep the dipstick from getting loose. And in this particular case, I did not push it all the way back in, and we lost, I think, almost 2 quarts of oil. And I don't remember exactly how much that engine held. I want to say it was in the neighborhood of 8 or 9 quarts, but the airplane ran fine, but still not not my
So
process.
when did you notice that
When
the
we
oil
landed,
was, you know?
there was no indication in flight at all that there was any kind of issue. I don't even know if we like smelled oil like leaking onto other parts of the engine or anything like that. I think we were just cruising along, happy and dumb, until we got back to Anchorage and got out of the airplane. So, but it's one of those lessons that I think most of us will encounter at some point in our flying career, where you just forget one little detail, and hopefully the consequences of that are minor.
Yeah, I've seen during flight school days where the person flying before me would have taken the oil dipstick out and placed it on the top of the engine cowling. And when they came back from flying, all of that oil that would have rested on top of the cowling came sliding down and all across the side of the airplane. Sort of like how you have it in the picture
Yeah,
here. Yeah, it wasn't it wasn't a good time. So yeah, that's important to always double check, and just to be careful about how you're placing things down and putting them where you don't necessarily need to put them.
absolutely, absolutely. So after about 1,000 hours of flying at that job, I knew I wanted to be an airline pilot, and at the time it was kind of a common requirement at the airlines that you would need a college degree, which I'd done a couple of years of community college before. So I came back to the Bay Area and enrolled. I did a couple more semesters of community college before transferring to San Jose State University. So I finished my degree there between 2004 and 2007, just basically doing summer school in addition to normal load of classes. In retrospect, I could have done it online through like Embry-Riddle while continuing to fly, but I actually kind of enjoyed having the college experience there. And I was, at the time, I was working at the airport at the FBO, to pay bills and just have money in general. But while I was getting my degree and working at the airport in 2006, I was actually fired from my job at the FBO, which it's a long story, but fortunately, right next door to the FBO that I worked at was an aircraft sales company, and I knew the owner. I'd spoken to the owner of the business before, let him know that, hey, I'm a commercial pilot. I've flown the 210 and the Duchess, and a few other GA airplanes. So if you ever need help, just give me a call. And one day he did call me. Fortunately, this was shortly after I lost my job at the FBO. And he said, "Hey, my aircraft detailer is he's on vacation. He's gone back to Mexico to visit his family. He's like, I need somebody to clean the airplanes." And I said, "All right, I'll do it." And I was out at his hangar washing and waxing the airplanes that he had. And one day, I've probably been doing it for a week and a half. And one day he says to me, he said, you said you flew the 210, right? And I said, yeah. He's like, would you mind taking this airplane up to Concord, it's other airport in the north side of the Bay Area? I said, yeah, sure. And so I did that. And then eventually he just started having me fly airplanes. Eventually he hired me on full time. And it was a really, really great opportunity while I was finishing my college degree to work for him. I got to fly so many different general aviation airplanes, including every version of the Bonanza, and a couple Barons, and all sorts of Cessnas, and few Pipers. So really, really good experience. However, what I learned from it was that as he hired me on as a salesman slash pilot, and I spent most of my time working in the office, answering the phones, and just kind of sorting out details on airplanes that were up for sale or coming on consignment. But what I discovered at that juncture there was like, I don't really enjoy the office part of this. I like flying the airplanes, and I was usually only flying a couple times a week. The bulk of my time was in the office, and so I knew at that point that I needed to get into some kind of full-time flying job. And so after I finished my degree, there was a management company right next door to us in the same office complex as the FBO, the aircraft sales company. We also had this Part 91 corporate management company. They had a couple of King Airs and a handful of Citation 500 series, like everything from the Citation 2, which is the 550, to the Ultra, which is this airplane in the picture here. But I mean, it's basically the same airplane. I never was typed in the Citation because my tenure there was so short. I was just sort of a right seat guy learning, and they were dangling the promise of getting me typed in the airplane, probably in a couple of months, just in a couple more months, we'll get to it.
Right.
But it never happened.
Just to cut you for a second, right?
Sure.
We have persons actually going to college right now, so this is actually backtracking a bit.
Sure.
So one question that we have in the chat is, how did you manage flying while studying?
Well, there was a couple of years there between 2004 and 2006 that I hardly flew at all. I mean, occasionally I would go do like a biennial flight review just to stay current. Or if one of my friends was flying, I would hop in with them. But there is a large chunk in my logbook, or large time span in my logbook there for about 2 years where I hardly flew at all. And that was really just a balance of like, I wasn't making a lot of money working at the FBO, just in addition to regular expenses. So there wasn't a lot of extra disposable income to spend on flying, and I couldn't really pick up a full-time flying job, to exercise my commercial privileges because I was in school full-time. So yeah, that was a little bit of a tough spot, but it kind of relates to another lesson about aviation in general that I think is important for people to keep in mind, is that while it is super important to try your best to stay current and active in flying, it's not unusual for guys to take breaks from flying for a couple of years and get back into it. It's not easy, but it is possible. And in fact, just this last month, I flew with a first officer who had been an airline pilot for many years, and then I think when him and his wife started having kids, he quit flying. He got his MBA. He worked as an accountant for a number of years, and he got back into flight instructing at some point and got current again. And then just within a few months, he got hired at Kalitta Air, which is really impressive if you think about it. Having been away from flying for that long and now just getting back into general aviation for a couple months, he had a job at Kalitta Air flying 747s. It's not ideal, but it's not impossible. So, and that's kind of, related to the, like I said earlier before we started, the non-linear path of my flying career. Is that if I had been really clever and efficient about it, I would have got my college degree first and then started flight training and then continued flying uninterrupted. But that's not how it worked out for me personally. And there may have, I mean, arguably there are better ways to go about it, but that's sort of how I ended up doing it.
All right, cool, thanks. Yeah, so you were saying about getting typed in the corporate jet.
Right. So that carrot kept getting dangled in front of me. But as you can see from this timeline here, 2008, 2009, we had a little bit of an economic crisis here in America, and I think probably affected some of the other parts of the world as well. But when the economy goes bad, people who fly private jets suddenly start thinking about other ways to spend their money, especially at this level, King Airs and Citations. They were our clientele, I think, in general, were much more vulnerable to economic swings. And so I was the most junior pilot at the company, and I was there for about 9 months when they laid me off due to the economy, which this is something that is kind of related to what's happening right now with the COVID crisis, is that there are a lot of professional pilots who are kind of scrambling to, figure out what they're going to do to pay the bills until, they get recalled by their airlines or whatever. What I ended up doing was working, doing contract work for NASA, or not directly for NASA, but companies that did research for NASA. This is Moffett Field, which is in the Bay Area. It's right, very, very close to San Jose, just up the road from San Jose, south of San Francisco. And this is all adjacent to Google, and Facebook is just off screen to the right here. So it's kind of in the heart of what we call Silicon Valley, but not a lot of activity in terms of aviation at Moffett Field these days. I think there's an Air National Guard unit there that they fly Black Hawk helicopters and C-130s, but really hardly anything at all happens there. Mostly just research, but I got research projects. I got hired on as a contract worker in what they called pseudo pilot, which the first big project I did there was they were looking to reconfigure one of the runways at LAX. And so they had a bunch of pilots sitting in computers in one room, kind of directing traffic. And they had a tower cab simulator in another room, which air traffic controllers were in. And so we were doing like this really massive simulation for these different runway configurations that they were testing out for LAX. And that project lasted for several months. There was a lot of other projects kind of in a similar vein, not always related to airports directly. Sometimes it was airspace things. Also, I didn't even know it at the time because I didn't have the experience, but like CPDLC, which is controller pilot data link. So basically communicating like via text message between pilots and controllers, which we use when we're, now I use when I'm flying oceanic and over, certain parts of northern Canada, and Europe uses it a lot now too. And so it hasn't quite been integrated in America yet, but we all assume it's coming at some point. But those were something we did there.
So the chat is slowly but surely coming alive.
Okay.
We had another question about having a degree. So I think this is one of the most common questions about having a degree and flying, and that is, does having a degree, or is having a degree, the only way of making it to the major airlines? Now the answer for that may vary, but from your experience, um, what advice would you be able to give where that is concerned?
From my experience, the short answer is no. It probably doesn't really matter. It and that's based on what we saw in the last 10 years, where we saw a lot of growth and a lot of hiring, especially with regard to the what was for several years the impending pilot shortage that everyone was afraid of. So there a few of the legacy airlines like Delta, United, American, they had that as a stated requirement for a while, but they I don't know if in the last few years if they still enforced it or they still mandated it. Um, but most other airlines didn't have that requirement. And I think one way of thinking about it is that it's just one way for airlines to kind of filter applicants where you can, it's just that sort of an added thing that you can put on there that would potentially differentiate you from somebody that didn't go to college. And you can get into like the nuances of, maybe it means that an individual is, willing like to sit down and do this kind of work and see it through for a couple of years. Although in my personal experience, that's not necessarily the case. I know a lot of people with college degrees who I wouldn't necessarily trust flying my family in an airplane. It doesn't make you a better pilot or anything like that. But I think from the hiring side of it, it's just a way to differentiate and filter applicants if you need to. And, potentially that we could be looking at that again if with the coronavirus, the pandemic flooding the market with pilots who have lost their jobs. Now it might become a requirement again for more places that they want to see that college degree. But I'm not 100% sure on that.
Right.
But couldn't hurt.
Right. I think from my perspective, I mean, I'm not at that level yet, but what I've researched from myself is that it just all depends on the carrier that you're looking to apply for, or the carrier that you want to fly for. Um, each carrier has its own requirements for their applicants or for persons who they hire. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
my point to add would just to be to do your research on the carrier that you're going to apply for, and just make sure that you take all of those check boxes when you're looking to apply.
Yep. Absolutely. So yeah, so during this time working at NASA, now I'm back to really not flying a lot. I occasionally, my old boss at the aircraft sales company would call me to come help him move an airplane somewhere. But I wasn't, there was a year there where I didn't fly very much. And so I ended up going back to aerial mapping, but this time in the Bay Area, my roommate who I was living with at the time happened to be the chief pilot of this company, Aperture Aviation, who did aerial mapping. This time with actually with cameras. This was not related to cable television, or we weren't looking for signal leakage. This was literally taking pictures of the Earth from an airplane. And this is one of the airplanes, as you can see, they modified it with these long exhaust pipes. And that was just to keep the exhaust gases away from the camera hole, which was like right around here in the aft part of the cabin. So they wanted to get the imagery as clear as possible. So that was back to low altitude GPS grid flying. I did that for about a year. All over the country again. And that was a nice, it was nice to get back into flying. It was a little hard. It was kind of a tough pill to swallow to go back to single engine Cessnas, but that's kind of how this career can go sometimes. And I'm certainly not the first pilot to, think that they were progressing along and have the economy or some external force completely upend the whole thing. And so, you know, swallow your pride. Sometimes you have to do that and go back to single engine Cessna flying. But shortly thereafter, I went over to Ameriflight. They had a base in the Bay Area. I flew the Piper Chieftain there out of Oakland for about a year and a half. It was good experience in the sense that it looks good on a resume. I didn't particularly enjoy the flying. You know, the airplanes were very old and not in the best shape. And you know, single pilot IFR flying. Although California doesn't really have terrible weather, it could on occasion. There was a couple of airports we went to, like on the coast, that were occasionally foggy or frequently low clouds, marine layer kind of stuff. And it just wasn't a great lifestyle for me, because while I was home every night, that's not necessarily why I got into a flying career. You know, I like the way I have it now, which is seeing the world and experiencing different countries and cultures. So as great as it is to be home every night, it kind of takes a little bit of the magic out of flying. And plus, in addition to the equipment being pretty run down, the pay was not great either. But it was there. It was a job that kind of advanced me a little bit further. And in 2012,
I have a,
oh yeah,
go ahead. Right. I just wanted to ask if you had a preference in what kind of flying job you were applying for, or what kind of flying job you wanted to do coming into flying, or is it just a case where you just happen to
well,
do
I
the
think,
cargo and stuff like that?
yeah, I think when I was a kid, I wanted to be a fighter pilot in the military. But you know, I did. In America, we have ROTC in high school, or junior ROTC, which is kind of like, it's basically like a recruiting program that the military puts in at the high school level to kind of get kids interested in the military. And I did that for 3.5 years in high school, and I really enjoyed it for the most part. But towards the end, I think I kind of discovered that, like, man, I don't have the personality for the military. And in addition to that, I didn't have the best academics when I was in high school either. So if you're going to be a pilot in the military, you really have to have really good academics. And so, you know, for me, it became kind of obvious that just wasn't going to be a route for me. Then I thought I wanted to be an airline pilot. And in my college years, when I was working for the aircraft sales company, just the people that I was around at the San Jose airport, which was a very corporate aviation intensive airport, just because it's right there in the Silicon Valley. Lots of, you know, Google, Apple, all sorts of tech companies flying lots and lots of private jets in and out of there. And so that was in that environment, the corporate aviation seemed like the ideal place to go. And a lot of guys that I kind of looked to as mentors would say, "Oh, you know, you don't want to go to the airline because the airlines are terrible. They don't pay good. It's boring. Like this is really good flying." And I bought into that, and so I kind of deferred that airline dream to try and do the corporate thing. And in the end, I kind of discovered that that wasn't my cup of tea. So in 2012, when I finally did get to Skywest Airlines, this is what I came to do. This is the flying that's for me. And I don't want to put like a negative spin on it, but it really appeals to my laziness, because with all the other flying jobs that I had previously, you're doing all of this sort of extracurricular stuff. You know, when it was aerial mapping, it's like you're you're working, you're checking the computer files, you're making sure the frequency listening equipment is calibrated correctly. You're coordinating with air traffic control to make sure you can fly in their airspace before you even get off the ground. There was same thing with the other aerial mapping job. Aircraft sales, obviously I was doing a lot of office work, sales calls, stuff like that. Even Ameriflight, you're loading the cargo with, when you're at your domicile, you're loading it with the people at the station. But when you're out away from your domicile, you're the one loading the airplane all by yourself. There's nobody there to help you. And so when I got to the airlines, even though starting pay at the regional airlines is pretty abysmal, or at least it was at the time, I just loved the fact that I had my schedule a month in advance, and all I had to do was show up and fly the airplane. I didn't have to do anything else, which is exactly the way I always wanted it. I just never knew it.
Sounds like a dream.
Yeah, it's great. And like now that I fly cargo, a very common question I get from people is like, oh, you must love flying cargo because you don't have to deal with passengers. And I say, well, it doesn't really matter what's behind the cockpit door. Like airline pilots are very minimal in their customer service role. Yeah, you might greet people at the door and make the announcements, but you shouldn't be in the back of the cabin breaking up fights or, telling somebody to behave themselves or whatever. Like, that's not the pilot's job. And that's kind of what I discovered at the airline. It's like anything that's happening behind the cockpit door, it's somebody else's job. I mean, to a certain extent, as the operating crew, yes, you're responsible for the airplane and the contents of the airplane, but any sort of dispute or disruption that comes from passengers directly, that's not a pilot's responsibility. There's airport police and customer service representatives for the airline that handle that business. And so I always tell people, if you see those videos, those viral videos that pop up, cell phone videos from the cabin when something crazy is happening in the cabin of an airplane, as soon as you see the pilot walk into the frame of the video, then he's already made a mistake. He should have just stayed in the cockpit and called airport police or whatever, So.
But what if there's no airport police and you're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? And then say there's a huge brawl in the cabin.
Yeah, in that case, you got to just divert to the nearest possible runway, because any place with a runway big enough for a transatlantic or transoceanic airliner, there will be a police force nearby of some description. So that, obviously in flight now in the post 9/11 world, you should never open the cockpit door. That's not a consideration anymore. So
even if everybody's getting attacked in the cabin, you can't really do anything.
Yeah, and that's the lesson that we all learned from 9/11 was that you just don't open the cockpit door anymore, because the consequences of that could be much worse than anything happening within the cabin itself. So I started flying Skywest on the Brasilia, the turboprop there. Very, very unpleasant airplane to learn, because it has kind of it was designed in the mid 80s, very complicated systems, not friendly for your first airplane, airliner that you have to learn the systems on, because it had a lot of systems. It had 3 different prop governors. It had a complicated electrical system. Everything about that airplane was just overwhelming. I remember just walking out of the ground school when we did our final systems test, just feeling completely shell-shocked. I mean, fortunately, our whole class passed. Everyone did fine, but it was mentally extremely exhausting to learn. Flying the airplane was generally pretty fun, based in Fresno, California, LAX, and San Francisco, just mostly going up and down the West Coasts. A lot of fun, a lot of beaches, a lot of beachside layovers. Generally, an enjoyable experience. I did eventually transfer over to the CRJ just because it looked like a more comfortable airplane to fly, certainly less noise and vibration. So I flew that airplane, or the 200 and the 700 version of it, through 2014, 2015. And is there any questions on the Brasilia or the CRJ or the regional airlines in general before I go on? Because the next stop is Kalitta and cargo flying. So,
how was the change from the that turboprop to the CRJ?
Man, it was fantastic because, you know, when I was in ground school for the Brasilia, it was really stressful, like studying every night, just trying to absorb and understand the airplane, the systems of the airplane in a meaningful way, that I could, you know, tell to the instructor during an oral exam or you know, written systems exam, something like that. You know, that was the stress, because like you had to pass the check ride, just continue employment at the company. So it was a very stressful experience in ground school on that airplane, just because of how complex it was. The CRJ was like, it was like ground school was like being on vacation, because everything was so much more simplified from the Brasilia, and especially in terms of how you interfaced with the systems, just in general day-to-day line flying, because it has CRTs, you know, screens, right? And I can pull up a synoptic for any one of the systems, and that creates like a picture for you to understand what's going on with the airplane, and it tells you like, oh, you know, hydraulic system 1, I can't remember exactly what the hydraulic systems were called on that airplane, but hydraulic system 1 is failed, and it tells you exactly what you've lost.
So I'm guessing in that old turboprop, if you wanted to know if you lost the engine, you just have to look out the window and see.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, anything bad that happened in the turboprop, you had to go to the QRH and, you know, like go through the procedures and be like, okay, so we've lost this, and this. But yeah, the CRJ was a much more user-friendly airplane in that regard. And the ground, like I said, the ground school experience for the CRJ was like being on vacation. You know, I'd go to the bar. There was a bar right next door to our hotel and at the training center. I'd go to the bar every night and have a couple beers and go home on the weekends. You know, it was such an easy airplane to learn, and you know, generally a fun airplane to fly. I would say the 200 it's a notoriously gutless airplane. Doesn't like to fly above 30,000 feet when it's got like a normal passenger load. But the 700 was a great airplane, and yeah, the only complaints I would really have about the CRJ is that the cockpit windows didn't open, so it could get kind of hot in the cockpit on the ground in the summertime. And the 700, man, it was nearly impossible to get consistently smooth landings in that airplane, because when you're in the flare, you're basically, you know, a normal flare drives the main landing gears into the runway. So there's probably some technique to doing it consistently smoothly, but I never learned it. So those are my only 2 complaints about that airplane. But yeah, in 2015, end of 2015, I got a call from Kalitta for a job interview, and ended up going there. I was about to upgrade at Skywest, but I was going to have to take a domicile in like either Minneapolis or Detroit in the middle of the country, and I didn't really feel like commuting to Reserve, and this was an airplane that I always wanted to fly, and the kind of flying that I always wanted to do. So took the opportunity, and it's ended up being one of the best one of the few really smart moves I've ever made in my career. But I feel, very fortunate to be here right now. What's that?
No, I was saying, especially with what is going on right now in the world.
Yeah, that's right.
Being with a cargo carrier has its advantages.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'll tell you, I'd applied to United Airlines, and I was anticipating a phone call for an interview late last year, and I didn't get the phone call, and I was starting to feel kind of bad for myself. And since this crisis happened, it's been really, really fortunate for us in the cargo world, because our business has just gone up with the loss of the passenger airlines. Obviously, in case anyone's not aware, they do fly a certain amount of cargo in their lower cargo holds. So with the loss of regular passenger flying, all of a sudden there's an increase in demand on moving cargo, and that's been hugely beneficial to our company, and air cargo in general seems to be doing really well right now. So yeah, if I had been hired by United and during the time frame that I kind of expected to, I would be in deep trouble right now. I'd be incredibly nervous. So I just sheer dumb luck that I'm on a safe island at the moment. But this industry is unpredictable, and never hold your breath for too long, because something unfortunate could happen tomorrow for cargo. Who knows? But for the moment, I'm enjoying it. We're having a good time, and doing a lot of flying. I'll just run through some quick things here. That's me. And other than kind of the fun aspect of the pictures here, it does illustrate two things that I really, really love about this company and this kind of flying, is that the picture on the left was taken in Tokyo, Japan, and the picture on the right was taken in Helsinki, Finland. So just getting to see these places and visit these places, to me, is such a gift, and I really, really appreciate it. That part of, not that going to places like Oklahoma City or wherever we were flying at Skywest wasn't nice, but this is a little bit better. So and there's that's the view that I have in the twilight hours normally.
Where is that? Is that an oceanic crossing?
This doesn't look like an oceanic crossing to me. I'd have to zoom in on the ND here, but it looked, just based on the waypoints that are in that section of the navigation display, I would say that it's probably not an ocean crossing. So, but
do you do like domestic flight? Do you do flights around Europe, or when it's not an oceanic crossing, it's in America?
Oh yeah, we go anywhere and everywhere. I've flown flights as short as like 15-20 minutes, like repositioning in California, also in places like Europe. I think I did like a half-hour flight from Brussels to some place in Germany a couple years ago. So yeah, there's huge variation in the kind of flying.
How high do you fly in a 747 in a 20-minute flight?
Less than 10,000 feet. The flight, the shortest flight I did, I think we went to maybe 7,000 feet, and then it was basically going from one traffic pattern to another traffic pattern at adjacent airports. I think the airports are about 50 miles apart.
So you'd come into airport CTAF, you'd have some 172 ahead of you, you'd be like, whatever your call sign is, super, we're joining left downwind, we're looking for traffic.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, we don't go to a lot of uncontrolled fields, but occasionally it happens. And
so there'd be a Cessna 172 in the pattern doing being on downwind, and they hear a 747 is joining the downwind with them.
yeah, well, if he's on if there's a Cessna on a 5-mile final, I'll just extend my downwind as much as possible to give me some space. That's probably what I would do. But
and then he calls a go around.
Yeah, actually, you know, just it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't an uncontrolled airport, but just 2 months ago, I was in Lake Moses, Washington. There's a bunch of cherry farms out there. We're taking several tons of cherries out, but you're sharing the traffic pattern with. They're not Cessnas, but there was a flight school there, and they had a bunch of these little low-wing trainer airplanes buzzing around the pattern, and so we had to wait our turn to take off between all these little trainers. But yeah, you know, it works.
It sounds fun.
Yeah, it is fun. And then this is just kind of a picture of highlighting the extremes of the airplane. On the left is that's the unloaded airplane. That's the nose strut. You see. Yeah, probably. You guys use the metric system, right? You're part of the civilized world. You don't use imperial units.
Yeah,
you know, maybe metric. Like a third of a meter of strut showing there, and then loaded with.
That's a full load.
What's that?
That's a full load right there.
I don't know if it's a full load, but it would be pretty close. This is in Hong Kong, and it's pretty rare that we ever go out of Hong Kong not close to fully loaded or close to max takeoff weight. So what it could be 100,000 pounds or 200,000 pounds. I'm not sure, but I mean, think about how big and heavy the 747 is. That's a lot of strut travel right there.
Yeah, that does look like a lot.
Yeah. So, and that's kind of the beauty of the job too, is that pretty much anything that fits in a 747, we'll fly it. And, you know, I've flown everything from horses to mail to these were giant spruce beams that were used. I think they were used for building, I can't remember. I want to say it was building ships, but it might have been just regular structural for like a building. But anyway,
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if you would know this, but how much does it cost to send things by 747? Because it's very expensive.
Yeah, it is expensive. Obviously, a 747. You know, if you just think about how much gas we burn when we're flying, and if you're going to use a 747, it's because you need the volume or the weight, or in the case of this, you know, the length of these beams, they probably couldn't fit in through a standard side cargo door on like a 777, which is why we were loading them through the nose here, because they're too long to angle through the side door. So that's kind of one of the things about the 747 that gives it hopefully long-term usability, is that it can just handle things that other airplanes simply can't. And
no other plane could take something like that easily, right?
Well, yeah, certainly not a civilian airplane. You know, a military cargo plane with the same, like either with a rear door or a nose door could do it. But
yeah, the only other plane I see that fitting in is like a Cessna 152 in the back. But other than that, won't be.
Yeah, and this is kind of an interesting. On the right side here, you see how you just have hundreds. I mean, they hadn't even really completed the strapping plan here, but normally standard cargo pallets and ULDs, which is I believe that stands for Universal Loading Device, which are like the cans, if you will. They slide into locks on the floor, and that's how they stay secure to the cargo floor. There's locks that go up in between the pallets, and there's on the side of the floor here, there's a thing that keeps everything held down so it doesn't fly up and hit the ceiling. Well, with a load like this, you can't use pallets or ULDs, so you literally have to create a strapping plan and use hundreds and hundreds of these ratchet straps to secure the load. So I mean, I think it took them 4 hours to get everything strapped down in here. It was really extensive when they finished it too. There's just bags and bags of the straps sitting up here.
Have you ever had these things? You've never had this come loose and fly, have you?
Not that I'm aware of.
Because you know about that case. I forgot what it was. It was happened. I'm not sure. The plane was hauling a truck or something, and the truck got loose.
Oh yeah,
all the way to the back, and it moved the CG.
Yeah, that's something that's very present in our minds.
So
and
that's why you guys are there, right? To make sure it's secure.
Well, yeah. The thing is, the load master will give us a strapping plan for any load, and give us a briefing on how things were loaded or locked down like this. But I can really only take him at his word. Obviously we do a little bit of training on securing loads and stuff like that, but that's not my field of expertise. And if he had incorrectly strapped it, I wouldn't really have a efficient way to verify that. So you kind of take the load masters at their word, and you eyeball it as best you can, and decide if it looks reasonable to you. So
I have one more question, if you don't mind.
Yep.
Could you guys would you guys ever haul a liquid inside of this?
Yeah, well, it has happened in the past. I don't know necessarily at Kalitta Air, but I know other cargo airlines have transported marine mammals like orcas or dolphins, stuff like that. So yeah, you have an open.
But when you're at different pitches and altitudes and roll angles, the water will move and it'll move your CG with it.
Yeah, I mean that is a concern, and it's a risk. But on an airplane like this, like if you had an open tank or a pool of water sitting in the middle of the floor, and you had a huge pitch up or all of the water sloshed out, the airplane, you would feel the CG change. But I don't think, even with several 20,000 pounds of movement,
the arm on it wouldn't be big enough to do anything.
Yeah, I don't think it would necessarily disrupt the control of the airplane in any appreciable way, because we have a pretty big envelope for center of gravity and weight tolerances. So
when you're flying sail on this flight, were you close to that tolerance, or did you have a lot of work room left?
I doubt it. No, because the load was spread across the entire main deck, so it wasn't like it was like centered in one. Like the weight wasn't centered in one part of the airplane. Very occasionally, sometimes when we're like flying military cargo, like there'll be something really heavy on one side of the main deck, and you can almost detect a little bit of a roll change when you're hand flying. Like there's like a slight bias to one side, but that's pretty rare. That's and it's not like it's anything super weird or hard to control. So
cool. So you haven't had any bad cases with
no, not personally, no. In fact, we had a flight last year, I think, where the load master, and this is one of the problems doing things imperial and metric. We operate on the imperial system of pounds, but most cargo, like most of the world, is weighed in kilograms, and they were coming from somewhere in Europe, and the load master didn't convert the kilograms to pounds. So they actually had I want to say close to 100,000 pounds of extra weight on the airplane that they didn't plan for. Yeah, I mean, really bad when you think about it. I mean, it was a gross oversight by the load master. But the airplane took off quite normally and flew across the ocean. The only time, at some point in the oceanic crossing, they were like, our fuel burn is way off here. We're like way overburned. So they started looking at things and investigating, and they found that they're like, oh, we have the wrong weights, and they ended up making a landing. I don't know where they were going. It was maybe Cincinnati, but they landed in New York because they weren't going to have the gas to make it all the way to Cincinnati.
That's crazy.
Yeah,
Well, at least they made it to New York.
Yeah, it's one of those things that you kind of have to pay attention to, and that's why we look.
So why don't you guys just do your calculations in kilograms when you're going?
Yeah, well, I can't answer that question because I don't know. somebody at the top thinks, well, we've always done it in pounds, so we're going to continue in pounds. But I know Atlas Air Cargo does it in kilograms. They do all their stuff metric. So, but I can't really tell you why our company decides to do it imperial. But fortunately, it didn't result in any accident or anything like that. But one of the things, this is kind of normal cargo here that you have, standard cargo netting holding it down, and on the right side, the pallets are locked into the floor. They slide into these floor locks, so you don't have to worry about it coming loose or hitting the ceiling, zero G situation or something like that. So
interesting.
Yeah. And then, and that's how they like to load the airplane. It's actually a good amount of space between the top of the cargo and the ceiling. Normally they like to, with the ULDs, they'll get within a couple of inches of the ceiling. They use every inch they can get.
Yeah, because I imagine it costs a lot.
Yeah, exactly. If you're going to use the 747, you might as well use
as much as
every inch of it that you can.
I like what you guys are hauling right there on the right. Good, that's good stuff right there.
Yeah, face masks.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is actually this is Chinese cargo, which has been we've had this huge demand for cargo out of China since the COVID crisis started, because they're through their industrial capacity, they're able to manufacture personal protective equipment in huge numbers. So we fly into all sorts of Chinese industrial cities, and a lot of the stuff coming out is just personal protective equipment. So
that whole flight was just face mask and all kinds of other PPE?
That's exactly correct. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I assume most of it was. Yeah, that seems to be what the bulk of our cargo flying is. As the flight crew, the only thing you really know about your cargo is if it's hazardous material, or if it's like live animals or something perishable that requires temperature control. Other than that, unless somebody tells you what it is, it's usually not. It's just nondescript boxes and stuff.
How would you haul a live animal? How does that
work? There's like specially designed pallets that allowed the animal to be accessible to a veterinarian during flight. Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I did a flight with a bunch of horses, like for Cirque du Soleil, which they have some show with a bunch of horses in it. We literally had, 40 horses on the main deck. And hauling animals is interesting because, first of all, it makes the airplane stink. They relieve themselves right where they're standing, so it smells like a barn.
They're not the glamorous part of the job.
Yes, among many non-glamorous parts, but certainly, getting off of a livestock flight, you don't smell very good.
Is it loud as well? Or are they crying out loud while you're flying?
No, you don't really hear them. Not on the upper deck. They were pretty quiet. I didn't hear anything.
It's interesting.
And so I'll just get into this here. This is, I thought, probably of interest to most people in aviation. This is our flight plan fuel block. And this is kind of like, as a captain, one of the most informative parts of the flight plan paperwork that I look at when we get to the airplane, because I know where the airplane's coming from, I know where it's going, I know what time it's departing. That's all kind of general stuff. The other things that will be of consequence to me, obviously, are weather, and if anything on the airplane is broken or deferred. But really, there's a lot of good information here that, as a captain, I need to take into account. So, just starting up at the upper left-hand corner here, destination KCVG, which is Cincinnati. This was a flight from Brussels to Cincinnati. I'm just going to check something really quick here, make sure. Okay, go back. Oops. Sorry about that. Okay, so Brussels to Cincinnati. So right here, this first line of my fuel block tells me the burn, which is saying from Brussels to Cincinnati, it's going to require 203,900 pounds of gas. But really, what's more informative here is the time, the flight. This is the flight time, 7 hours and 58 minutes, and you'd be really surprised at how close the flight plan time is to the actual time. So that's the time that we're going to be in the air, and you can usually tack on, you know, a half an hour on either side of it for taxi and engine startup and stuff like that. And then also right next to it here, flight level 320. That's the planned flying altitude. Now that obviously changes during the course of a flight for things like weather, and then as we burn off fuel, sometimes the VNAV system will say, hey, you should climb higher for better, you know, efficiency or better performance. And it's also looking at forecast winds as well for its altitude selection. So, but that's just what the flight is planned at 320. So theoretically, you could go the whole way at 32, although they do build in a step climb at some point. But and then the distance in nautical miles, 3711. And then this right here, the wind, I don't really look at this too closely, but just as sort of trivia, it's just saying that based on the forecast winds. Well, does anyone want to guess what the M stands for?
Minus 19.
Yes, exactly. So basically a headwind, right?
Mm.
So yeah, so that's just saying the average headwind, or the average wind for the flight is going to be 19 knots of headwind. And then
Before you go to the second line,
yeah,
I have a stupid question, right?
oh,
So
as long as I'm not the one feeling stupid.
So 7 hours, it's a long time. It's a long time to be sitting there.
Oh,
So
yes.
what my question is does it feel long? I know obviously 7 hours is a long time, but you know, driving for 3 hours as opposed to being a passenger for 3 hours, the timing feels different. So is flying an airplane for 7 hours with all of the tasks that you have to do, does it feel like 7 hours, or does it feel shorter?
So if you'd asked me this question when I was flying at Skywest at the regional airlines, I would have said, wow, 8 hours of flight time. That sounds like that's a long time to be sitting in the seat. But now that I'm kind of conditioned to long haul flying, 8 hours, you're like, that's not bad. That's not a bad flight. You know what, 10, 12, 14, then you're like, oh man, we're in for a long day. Like right now we have a scheduled flight for DHL that goes from Cincinnati, Ohio to Bahrain in the Persian Gulf. I think that's planned at 14 hours and change. So that's a long flight.
Yes.
And the longest flight I've ever done at this airline was over 16 hours from Kuwait to California. That was a very long flight. And it's not really even about sitting in the seat necessarily. It's just about being in the airplane physically. You know, there's not, even though the 747 is a big airplane, the space that we have on the upper deck is pretty minimal, and so you start to feel a little cramped after a while. And you know, especially long flights where you have double crew. Normally we have a mechanic on the airplane at all times. Sometimes there's a load master, so you can kind of be like running into each other all the time. Like if you go to the lab or you go to the galley, it gets a little annoying. But Yeah, 8 hours. Once you're conditioned to this, like 8 hours isn't that bad. And we were actually a double crew for this, so broke the. I was only in the seat for about 3.5 hours, and the rest of the time I was laying flat in the bunk, trying desperately to get a nap in before I before I got back to Cincinnati. But yeah, so the next line just tells us our alternate, which is Louisville, and it says they'll take 10,000 pounds, 17 minutes at 10,000 feet to go 73 miles. We have holding fuel built in, usually at least a half an hour of holding fuel. They also have this reserve fuel that varies on the kind of flying that we're doing. There are certain reliefs we can get on reserve fuel. There are certain loopholes because obviously it's always a balance between how much gas, how much weight of the airplane are we going to commit to gas. And sometimes, if you have to have a minimum amount of reserve fuel per some regulation, you're not going to be able to carry the amount of payload for the distance that you need. So there are a few regulatory loopholes that we employ occasionally to reduce the reserve fuel. But this flight, it was not a big deal. There was no concern about that. They even have this additional 5,000 pounds of gas just as kind of bonus fuel for you. Ballast, I've never actually used ballast fuel, but it's something that we learn, and it's an option that we have if you're carrying something like really awkward, like part of a wind turbine. You have this really long thing that's only heavy on one end. You might want to have ballast fuel in one of the tanks, like the center tank, which is the most forward of the tanks, to balance out the load. But that becomes unusable fuel. Obviously, it's there strictly as ballast to put the center of gravity where it needs to be. Then the next line here is min fuel, which is basically saying that per everything else on this flight plan, when you set the takeoff thrust on the runway, you need 245,700 pounds of gas, or you shouldn't take off, because then you're not within the legal scope of what you need to conduct the flight. So that's basically like when you're turning on the runway, you want to be above that number, purely for legal reasons. You could theoretically be below it and be confident that you'll have no problem getting to your destination, but that's there to cover the legal base of reserve fuel and holding fuel and alternate fuel, all the stuff that we need as a 121 airline. Extra, that's just there just for the flight planner. It's never really used in my experience. Taxi, you see they have this plan for 3,000 pounds of taxi fuel. This just happens to be because normally it's 2,000 pounds, but on this occasion, the runway near the cargo ramp has been closed in Brussels for a little while. I think they're doing some runway construction. Excuse me. And so they knew that it was going to be a long taxi, so they padded it with an extra 1,000 pounds. And that brings you to your total ramp fuel, 248,700 pounds, which should be good for 9 hours and 47 minutes of endurance. That's the number that you're going to tell the fuel truck to bring the aircraft fuel up to. And then on the right column, we have basic operating weight, which is the weight of the airplane, including, oil, and I think that includes 2 pilots and some amount of luggage. But that's the basic operating weight. So that's your base weight. Now the payload here, 180,000 pounds. That's a round number. It's obviously it's not going to be 180,000 even, but for flight planning, they'll start with the closest estimate they can get, and it'll go up and down depending on the customer or whatever's happening with the cargo. We can tolerate, with this flight plan, I can tolerate it going 10,000 pounds up or 10,000 pounds down, and I can keep the same performance numbers here. Now, if it exceeds either one of those, especially obviously going up, if it goes over 190,000 pounds, then I need a new flight plan with new fuel burns and stuff like that, because that's just enough of a margin that it's going to affect the performance nominally, that you might as well just get new performance numbers. And in other cases too, it can be where it's going to affect your ability to use a runway. You know, if the runway is 9,000 feet and it's hot and humid, you know, maybe 190,000 pounds is too much. So it's one of those things that we have to keep an eye on. That will change too. Normally they overestimate in flight planning, so that you go with worst case scenario, and usually the load master will be like, oh yeah, the load was only 175,000 pounds, so you don't worry about it.
I have a question. You said about hot and humid. Do you guys actually check the density altitude at the airport?
No, we don't. I mean, we can if we wanted to, but because our performance numbers are generated essentially automatically, and with a fairly heavy margin for error, we wouldn't go into calculating specific density altitudes. And normally what will happen on a normal flight is that you tell the ACARS computer, you say, okay, this is my zero fuel weight, this is my fuel that I have on board, this is the runway I want to use. And you'll also tell it, like, oh, if the runway is wet, the runway is dry, or there's snow on the runway. You give it like environmental inputs, variables, and then you send it off to outer space, wherever it goes, and it gives you back the performance numbers. So in that calculation that it returns to you, you have the density, altitude, the temperature, and it's actually supposed to know the runway condition too, based on current weather information. So it should, even if you didn't tell it that the runway was wet, if the runway is wet, the ACAR should know that. But they build a large margin into things like that, so it wouldn't be a big deal depending on the weight of the airplane.
In a plane like that, how big of a factor is a wet runway?
Well, you know, it can be very big for takeoff performance, because not obviously for the speed that you take off at, but if you have to do a high speed reject, because it affects braking performance, right? So if I'm at maximum takeoff weight in Hong Kong it's in a downpour, if I have to reject the takeoff, if I have an engine failure right at V1, it's going to take a lot of stopping power to bring 872,000 pounds back to zero, 0 miles per hour, 0 knots. And if the runway is wet, that's a huge hit on braking performance. So that's where the wet runway really factors in, is on takeoff.
So traction doesn't come into that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right.
But is there a reason why your tires are so smooth on planes like that though? You don't have any grooves in it, so you would
Well, they do have water channeling, but most of the water channeling is on the runways. Smaller airports that don't have airline service, there's no requirement for water. I mean, there might be a requirement. I'm not 100% sure, but airline runways at international airports, most of the runways that we go into are grooved for water channeling. So the tire does have a little bit of water channeling. Obviously, you've seen pictures of them. They're mostly smooth, but most of the water dispersion happens at the pavement level of the runway as opposed to the tire level.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so the zero fuel weight is basically the basic operating weight plus the payload. Then you're adding the takeoff fuel, which is in this case, the min fuel, 245.7 rounded up there for that, and this is the gross takeoff weight. So this is where you start to look at, like, what can I do in terms of where are my margins? Like, yeah, long dry runway, I'll go all the way up to max max weight if I have to, you know, if the situation calls for it. But if it's a shorter runway, contaminated with moisture, then that can be a big limiting factor for performance. And we also have, in addition to our flight plan, that we have what's called a takeoff landing report, which will tell you based on forecast conditions what your maximum weight for the runway is, or you know, multiple runways at an airport. Fuel burn.
Wait, one quick question: is this printed out for you?
Yeah, this is printed out. We normally kill several square acres of forest for every flight. It's upsetting how much paper we use for every flight. And
seriously, you can't get this on the iPad or something?
oh well, we do get it on the iPad too, but this is a holdover. This is, well, maybe a hangover is a better word. A hangover from the old days, where everyone needs a hard copy of everything. So yeah, unfortunately, we're still using a lot of paper, and it's.
So do all airlines have it like that, or do some airlines try and get you guys to just have it on the iPad, or is it a requirement to have a hard copy?
I don't know. At Skywest, we still use a paper copy, and I think most airlines still use it. I don't know if DeMar can answer for Air Canada, if they're more evolved than we are. But
yeah, so at Air Canada, we're on the iPad, but Jafaz, you have to realize as well that there are ramping requirements, especially if you're doing a lot of international flying. So what that means is that you could have the aviation authority in a specific country ramp your aircraft and check your master flight document, which this would be a part of, to make sure that you're doing all your fuel checks, make sure that you have all the airworthiness certificates and stuff like that. So at Air Canada, on the international flights where you're doing like a lot of fuel checks and stuff like that, they'll typically print out the flight plan to have a hard copy. On some of the domestic runs, we'll do all the work on the iPad, and we'll just keep a master flight plan that way, and just to kind of mitigate some of, you know, killing all the forests as mentioned here. So I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. And I think kind of globally, you know, everyone's aspiring to go to a paperless cockpit, but I think we're a long way from that, unfortunately. So yeah, the next line there, estimated fuel burn. That is, of course, the derivative of the destination fuel burn over there, the first number. And that's what the load master inputs into the computer to generate a takeoff CG and a landing CG, because obviously you want to make sure, you know, we're gonna burn 203,000 pounds of fuel. That's a lot of weight, and the 747 has a highly swept wing, so that means that your center of gravity is going to move quite a bit as the fuel burns. And so having that, the computer will generate a center of gravity envelope that shows that your center of gravity stays you know, legal and safe throughout the entire envelope for the flight. And then here's the other.
Wait, just a question. You said the 747 has a highly swept wing, right?
Yes.
How negatively does that affect your low speed handling? Like, does the plane handle horribly when you're at low speed?
No, not at all. It's got a lot of lift devices for low speed flying. It has a lot of flaps, and honestly, this airplane is one of the sweetest flying airplanes I have ever flown. Probably, I mean, I would venture to say it's probably the most enjoyable airplane to hand fly that I've ever
really
flown. I mean, the Bonanza is a great airplane. Really like flying that as far as, like, you know, response and control. But like the 747, you just have all the power you need. You have a giant wing it can fly slow, it can fly fast, and it's very responsive. And
what's the critical Mach number when you guys are flying? usually?
Well, the maximum Mach number is 9.2, but we're restricted to 9.0 in RBSM airspace.
Mm-hmm.
But we never fly that fast. I think the fastest we would fly in any regular normal flight would be 8.7, because anything faster than 8.7, you're just burning so much extra gas for almost zero net gain. You know, like across an 8-hour flight like this, if you flew it at Mach 9.0, you'd burn exponentially more fuel. I don't even know how much extra fuel you'd burn. You know, at least 50,000 pounds, I would guess, probably more. But you would get there, I don't know, 10 minutes earlier, you know. So for the customers, it's just not worth it to spend that kind of money on gas. Now the landing weight, this is the other big number for me that I'm looking at as a captain, because this will dictate if how much extra fuel I can put on the airplane. And sometimes I had a situation last winter going into Chicago from Anchorage. We were very heavy on payload, and we were maxed out for what we could take with gas and have be under our max landing weight, which is 652,000 pounds. So I could not take any extra gas other than the minimum that was on the airplane. But there was a blizzard forecast for our arrival. It was like perfect weather right up until our scheduled arrival time, and it was an extra insult because the airplane had been delayed for many hours coming out of Hong Kong. So it was just a perfect storm in terms of. I mean, I guess you could really categorize it as aeronautical decision making, right? Because you have a finite set of resources, and you're going into a poor forecast. In addition to the blizzard, we're getting there early in the morning, like I want to say it was like a 5 or 6 a.m. arrival time, which Chicago is a huge hub for United and American Airlines, and all the regional jets are coming and going at that hour to get passengers in and out of the hub before they go onto the main line. So that hour of the morning is super busy. We're flying, so I couldn't take any extra gas, and we were flying along from Anchorage for, I think it's like a 5-hour flight, I think, from Anchorage to Chicago. And we're monitoring the weather, and it's looking good. Everything's looking good. The TAF, the forecast hasn't changed. It's still forecast to go bad, but the weather up to that point was looking really good. Well, as we start our descent into Chicago, then you can see the weather starting to degrade, and now we're getting in line with other traffic that's going into Chicago. And sure enough, maybe 50 or 60 miles from the airport, they told us, all right, hold at this fix and expect further clearance in like 45 minutes. And it's like, well, I can't hold for 45 minutes. I don't have the gas to do it. So and my FO and I had been discussing this on the way over, and before we even started the descent, I think we agreed that, like, if we did get holding, we would hold for 15 minutes maximum. If we're not out of the hold in 15 minutes and on our way to being vectored onto the approach, then we're diverting to the alternate. And that's what ended up happening. And it's funny too, because air traffic control, especially like in America, I can't speak for the rest of the world necessarily, but in America, airports like Chicago, where they try to be really hands-on and helpful and keep things moving smoothly, you tell them, like, look, if I can't get out of the hold in the next 5 minutes, then we have to divert. And they'll say, wait, hold on. I think, if you can hold for 10 minutes, I can get you vectors onto the approach. If you can do 10 minutes, I'm like, okay, but it has to be at 10 minutes, and I have to be vectored onto the approach. If there's any delay, then I can't take it. There's no way, because I know there's like really bad visibility down there with the snow coming through. So, in the 747, we can land in, Cat 2, Cat 3 conditions, but I think the Cat 3 approach runway was not in use, so it had to be Cat 2. Still pretty likely that we'll be able to land no matter what, even using auto land. But you can't bank on that, because maybe the regional jet in front of me slides off the runway and they close the runway down while I'm on final. Now I have to go missed, and now I'm burning a bunch of extra gas at low altitude to go to my alternate. So just things you need to think about in aeronautical decision making along the way. Even in like I say, even in a plane like a 747, where you can land it in zero visibility, auto land Cat 3 if the runway will support it. You have to think about all the contingencies that could prevent you from getting to the destination, and make your decision there. This line down here is just saying that for every 237 pounds of payload that you add, it's going to, or sorry, for every 1,000 pounds of payload you add, it's going to be an extra 237 pounds of fuel burn that you would add to the total fuel. And then cost index, this guy is cost index. That's just for the VNAV system. That tells the airplane how fast it's going to fly. 77 is a very average number, probably Mach 8.4, 8.5 in cruise. And that's just about, you input that number into the FMC just to tell the airplane how efficiently it's going to fly. And it has a whole plan based on that. So, are there any further questions here before I move on?
So, based on the time constraints, I think we can move on for now.
Okay. Yeah. So this has gone a little bit longer than I thought, but we'll try and breeze our way through the systems.
Right. The remaining stuff.
Yeah, there it is. That's the airplane. The big number here in terms of dimensions is the wingspan, 211 feet. That's, as a captain taxiing the airplane around, that's what I'm mostly thinking about, because that's where you'll see on your airport diagrams, airplanes with wingspans longer than this, can't use this taxiway. So you have to pay attention to that. That's the overhead panel, and we'll go into detail on each section, but essentially this is all the systems control that we have for the airplane. And I'll break it down into these 3 columns that you can kind of see the layout there. Electrical system is the first one. It's got a very complicated electrical system that I had to learn at one point with all the buses and various things that I've completely, every year I learn them, and then I go to training and I brain dump them as soon as I walk out of the building, because as you can see, quite mercifully, my interface with the electrical system is extremely simple. I can either isolate one of the generators from the main bus, or I can reset a generator, or I can disconnect a generator, and that's really it. We have a standby power feature here. We check that on every flight of the day, and that's just to make sure that when you the power will transfer to the battery bus in the event of complete electrical failure. So, and then these down here are this middle row here is you have external power 1, external power 2, and then the APU also has 2 generators. Normally we just use external power 1 or APU Gen 1. That'll run almost all the essential ground systems while we're on the ground. These 2 switches up here, utility bus switches, that's just for load shedding. It's very rare that we ever touch those, but occasionally we do. If we have like a weak ground power unit, sometimes we'll turn off a couple of the utility buses during engine start because of other systems that are drawing on the electrical system during the start process. But above that here, this is not related to the
That's mine.
No, it's not this way.
Why don't you try mine?
Sorry, my daughter just came in. These are the IRSs, the inertial reference systems. Prior to the early 90s, I believe it was the early 90s, we didn't have, our airliners didn't have access to the GPS network. So for oceanic flying, you didn't have ground stations, VORs and NDBs to provide position reference. Many years ago, they developed this inertial reference system, which is a self-contained system within the airplane that provides basically your position in space. It used to be mechanical gyros like you have, on general aviation airplanes, an actual physical spinning disc or gyro. But now it's all laser reference, which is obviously much more reliable and much more accurate. And the IRSs actually provide data for our auto brake system. It also provides obviously the attitude, heading reference, and also vertical speed. So we don't use a normal pedostatic system for vertical speed reference. It's done through the IRSs, although there is a backup. And then up at the top here, that's just electronic engine control, which provides, that's the computer system, the 1980s computer systems that provide the FADEC protections on our engines. Occasionally, the computer will have a little bit of a problem. You'll have to turn one of those off. You can operate. Actually, I think if you have to turn one off, you have to turn them all off. I'd have to check the QRH for that, but occasionally that happens. It's pretty rare though. And the auto throttles still work even without electronic engine control. So, and this is just a synoptic page for the electrical system. Very, very simple.
I have a quick question.
Yep.
What would make you want to turn off the FADEC system?
If there's a problem with in the computer software, or potentially even the hardware, so you'll get a message, and I think the ICAS message is something like EEC 1, 2, 3, or 4, and usually it'll give you like an opportunity to reset the system just by pushing the switch light up there in and out, and if the message stays lit after the reset, then you know that then it's like, okay, well, you tried, so turn them all off. And that's just so that the engines are all operating on the same reference and schedule.
But if you turn it off, you would lose auto throttle, wouldn't you?
No, you still actually maintain a lot of protections. Like I don't think you can overboost the engines with the EEC controls turned off. There's another layer of protection in there that you would lose, like boost protection. But I'm pretty sure even with the EEC turned off, you still have some built-in protection with the engines.
I understand.
All right. Hydraulic system is another big one. Let's see. First of all, this bottom row here. Well, the bottom, that's part of the light panel down there. They turn on and off lights inside the cockpit. But this panel right here, these switch lights always stay in unless there's a QRH, something happens and a QRH procedure directs you to turn one of them off. Those are the engine-driven hydraulic pumps. Those are doing all the primary work for hydraulics. So they're always on. I've never had to turn one off, thankfully. And they seem incredibly reliable. They provide all the heavy lifting for the individual hydraulic systems, of which there are 4. Now here on the next level up, these rotary switches are the demand pumps. And this is where there's a little more hands-on with the pilot on every flight. We have two kinds of engines in our fleet. We have the Pratt & Whitneys and the General Electrics, and they operate a little bit differently with regard to the demand pumps. On the General Electric engines, the demand pumps, the number 1 and number 4 on the outboards, they're powered pneumatically. So anytime, well, and I'm sorry, I'll just continue. The inboards are powered electrically. So the demand pumps are there to do two things. One is to support the engine-driven pumps during high demand situations, like you're lowering the gear and extending the flaps. But they're also there if the engine-driven pump should fail, and they can provide continued hydraulic pressure if an engine-driven pump fails. Okay, going back to being hydraulically and pneumatically and electrically powered. So the two outboards run off of bleed air. The two inboards run off of electricity on the General Electric engines. What that means for us is that we can start two engines at a time, because in the pre-start configuration, they're all in auto except for this one, number 4, which is in the aux position, which is running off of a separate, a lower load electrical bus. It's called the ground service bus or the ground handling bus. So you only have this number 1 hydraulic system using bleed air. So all the other bleed air can go to starting engines. So you have enough pressure in the system to start two engines at the same time. The Pratt & Whitney demand pumps are all pneumatic. And so because you need, or you don't need to, but procedurally we do leave these 3 in auto, even though the Pratt & Whitneys, we still have that aux for number 4. There is not enough bleed pressure in the system to start two engines simultaneously. So we start one at a time on the Pratt & Whitneys. Now, why does the number 4 system have this auxiliary system here running off of a completely separate electrical bus? That's because the number 4 system is the primary system for the brakes. So anytime the airplane is being moved on the ground, either by tug, well, only by tug, I guess. It's operating under its own power. It's got the engine-driven pump powering the system. The engines aren't turning. You're being pushed back from the gate. This system is operating on a separate bus, purely electrically, just to provide brake pressure. So that's why that's there. And also, in the case of the General Electric engines, it gives you a little bit of relief on the bleed air from the demand pump. Because if the engines aren't turning, the demand pumps are providing the power and drawing off of the bleed air system. So, and those are just warning lights up there that'll tell you if there's either a fault or if there is a lack of pressure in the system. So. Any questions on the hydraulic?
For the bleed air, it's all provided by AP, right?
That's correct.
When the engines are off.
Yeah, and so it's not unusual. It's really annoying, but it's not unusual to have an airplane with a broken APU, and then
so
you have
to use an ASU, wouldn't you?
Yeah, exactly, and that just complicates things even further, because now you have a much, usually, depending on the unit, you have a lower air pressure supply from the ground unit than you would from the APU. So sometimes you have to look, sometimes you might, it's like on the Pratt & Whitney engines, you turn the 2 inboard demand pumps to off just to create better pressure. Also, when we get to the bleed air panel, there's an isolation valve that you can use to close off the outboard section. And I had to do this in Anchorage just a few months ago. The ground powered air unit couldn't get enough air pressure out to number 4, which is the engine we normally start, it couldn't generate enough pressure. And so we thought, okay, well, what if we close the isolation valve between 3 and 4, so it's a shorter distance, it's basically a smaller space for the air to occupy, it could increase the air pressure. We'll start number 3, and that worked. And then we got the other engine started, so.
So the isolation valve locks off the air to that engine?
Yeah, I'll show you when we get to the air system part. It'll be more clear exactly what I'm talking about. Fire system and fire protection, fire detection and protection. The top here is that's the test that we run every flight, just to make sure that the fire loops in the engines and the APU are good. It also runs a diagnostic on the main deck and lower lobe smoke detectors, fire detectors. So it's just that button just tests as a diagnostic test of the fire systems. Emergency lights, those are just they're in the armed position for all operations, so that if you lose electrical power, you have battery powered lights to guide you to an exit. This switch is just to provides a backup for audio panels in case the captain or the FO like their audio panel doesn't work. They can't communicate through their normal system. You can switch it to the observer system. Interphone is to talk to. There's a couple of headset jacks. Okay. There's a couple of headset jacks around the exterior of the airplane that mechanics can use to talk to, like through all the engines. So that's the service interphone, just connects you to those maintenance headset jacks. This button, I don't know. I'd have to look up what it does. It's something that only maintenance uses. I think it's for transferring fuel from the outboard tanks to the inboard tanks. But anyway, fire system, you have 4 handles plus the APU. If you have a fire detection or fire alarm, it'll light up. And the memory item is to pull it, which disconnects that engine or the APU. Obviously from fuel, that would be the big thing, but also it disconnects the bleed air, hydraulic, and trips off the generator. And it also arms your fire bottles. Each wing has 2 fire bottles. So if pulling the handle and disconnecting everything doesn't stop the fire warning, then you turn the handle either to A or B, doesn't matter, and you wait. See if the fire bottle puts out the fire. If not, turn it the other way and use the other fire bottle. So, and that's the same with the APU, although the APU only has 1 fire bottle. It doesn't matter which way you turn it. And it's, I believe it's a halon. It's a halon system. Now, if there's a fire inside the airplane, you have 2 things happening here. You either have a main deck fire detection or a lower lobe fire detection. There's 2 different ways of addressing that. Because if it's on the main deck is too big to extinguish a fire with halon. Also, you don't want to expose yourself potentially to halon, even though it would fall down, not up into the upper deck. But if you have a fire detection on the main deck, that arms the this discharge button to address the main deck and not the lower lobes. And,
hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
So the main deck, if you have a fire and you hit this button over here, that will bring the cabin. It'll basically open up the outflow valves and bring the cabin altitude to 25,000.
Hold on, can you stop talking for a second? I'm gonna mute everybody so people can't unmute because I feel like there's some trolls here now.
Okay, you got me?
Yeah, you should be good now.
Okay, so yeah, main deck fire will, if you hit this discharge button, what that does is it opens the outflow valves to bring the cabin altitude up to 250, basically lowering the oxygen level for the fire. If there's a fire on the main deck, depending on what it might be, you're probably going to send somebody down to try and handle it with a fire, handheld fire extinguisher. Now, if you have lithium-ion batteries, then it's pointless, right? Like no fire extinguisher is going to stop a lithium-ion battery fire. If you have lithium-ion batteries on board and you get a fire detection on the main deck, you're going to the nearest piece of runway, no questions asked. Because there's no way you're going to stop that fire. Now in the lower lobes, obviously they're inaccessible and they're fairly isolated from us. Those have halon fire extinguishers, and there's two. If you discharge either one, you get the first thing that happens is one bottle will do a full blast of halon, and then there's a metered release of halon that goes for 334 minutes, I believe is the number, and that's due to the oceanic flying that we do. It's a regulatory requirement that you have to have a long amount of fire protection or fire extinguishing power, assuming that you're over the middle of the Pacific Ocean and you're a long way from landing. Oops, sorry. Let's see. Below that here, this is the start panel. This is a Pratt & Whitney start panel. I think the General Electric start panel, the only thing that's really different is that this ignition, the auto system, it's either auto 1 or 2. There's no both selection, but on the Pratt & Whitneys, we just normally keep it in the 1 position. These 4 knobs you pull out to open the start valve, and that basically allows bleed air to enter the high pressure section of the engine, spin it up, and when it gets to 50% N2, this switch should pop back in, and you hear it go click when it goes back in, and the light goes out. We have an auto start or a manual start feature on our airplanes. So the only difference really is that in auto start, you pull this and you automatically turn the fuel control switch on the throttle quadrant on, and then it does the whole startup procedure automatically. In the event of a manual start, you still pull the switch, and then you wait to introduce the fuel until you have 20% N2. It's actually very abnormal for us to do a manual start. So we have the.
I have a really stupid question.
Oh, please.
So the starters engages the starter motor. It's a pneumatic starter motor, right?
Yeah, it's just a valve that pumps air directly into the higher pressure section of the engine.
And the ignition ignites that fuel, right?
Right. Well, yeah. So the igniters will be going continuously until I want to say 60% N2, and then the normal idle of the engine should be enough for a self-sustaining combustion.
So it is compression ignition. Turbofan engines are compression ignition.
Right. The only time the electrical ignition comes on is when you select it on, which is this button right here, or when the flaps are out of the up position, or it's supposed to automatically come on when N2 falls below, I think below 60%. It might be 50%, but those are just protections that it has for sustaining ignition, Also, if you select a nacelle anti-ice on, electrical ignition comes on automatically as well.
And if you have a failure of the ignition system, do you have to keep what do you do in that kind of scenario?
Well, there's two. So the redundancy is that there's 2 ignition systems, and so if you get a failure of one, it'll just direct you to move this switch to 2. Select the other one, the other system.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
So, sorry. And then this little panel over here is for fuel dumping. When you turn the system on as directed by a QRH procedure, select either A or B, doesn't matter. And then this little dial right here, you can set to the exact amount of fuel that you want to remain when the fuel dump is complete. Once you have that number set, then you just open the 2 nozzles and the fuel starts going. So we get to play with that every year in the simulator. That comes up frequently. And here's the fuel system panel. Everything has every tank has 2 main pumps, and then inboard tanks 2 and 3 have override pumps because they're bigger, but not as big as the center tank, which is the biggest tank that we have. So in a full fuel load situation, the center tank will empty first. It has the most powerful pumps. It'll basically override the pressure of all these other pumps, even though they're on. It'll override the pressure to feed all the engines from the center tank. Now, once the center tank is empty, then main 2 and 3, the inboard tanks are feeding all 4 engines until you get equal level, which normally, I know the display here says 30,000 pounds, but normally it's about 28,000 pounds. Once you have 28,000 pounds in all 4 tanks, it'll direct you to go what's called fuel tank to engine. So all that is, we turn off these override pumps in 2 and 3, which basically equalizes the pressure between the tanks. And then we hit these 2 cross feed valves. So all that does is isolate each engine to its respective fuel tank. And I'll show you a picture on the next slide that kind of demonstrates something really abnormal about that. Nacelle anti-ice just pumps bleed air into the nacelles. Wing anti-ice, interestingly enough, or maybe not interesting, but the 747 only has wing, or surface de-icing on the nacelles and the wing, the main wing. The tail and the horizontal stabilizer do not have de-icing capability. And the wing de-ice does not work when the flaps are out of the up position. So if the flaps are extended, the leading edge device is out, the wing anti-ice can't work. So, but there's no prohibition from flying it into, I don't know if I'd fly any airplane into severe icing conditions, but there's no prohibition of flying it into icing conditions with the flaps extended, obviously unable to use the wing heat. So the airplane holds ice pretty good from what I've seen. Not that I've been in a lot of icing conditions with it where it was dramatic, but. And then over here is window heaters. Those are always on in flight. And I actually just had one fail on my last flight. The FO's window heat failed. And when we landed, his window got all fogged up because as we entered the denser, much more moist air, he was wiping his windshield screen with his hand and a napkin on final approach. It was pretty amusing, but he landed safely. It was fine.
He was the pilot flying.
What's that?
So he was the pilot flying the FO.
Yeah. I was the relief captain. I was sitting right behind him. I mean, you could still see through the windshield, and the captain obviously was there. And he said, if you're not comfortable at any point, just let me know and I'll take the airplane. But FOs don't get too many chances. They only get about 3 opportunities a month to land the airplane. So he wasn't going to give it up. He
Okay.
He stayed with it. And he had a really nice landing actually. So worked out just fine. Also, I'll just comment very briefly on this. The windshield washers, are supposed to have these jets that spray water on the windshield. This is one of the worst things about flying the 747 is the windshield is always dirty because we don't have side windows that open, so we can't reach out and clean the windows ourselves. And obviously the windshield is so high off the ground that there's very few places that actually have access to clean the windshield for us. So these things are supposed to spray water on the windshield, which when the tanks have water in them, they do, but they spray like a tiny jet of water onto like like a square inch of the windshield. It's completely useless. So that's one of the worst things about the 747, dirty windshields. Oh, and also one more thing. This is a passenger airplane. We don't have the stab tanks, which are fuel tanks and the horizontal stabilizers. We max out on payload weight to the extent that carrying extra fuel in the stab really it's not advantageous to us. So those don't exist on our airplanes. Any questions? All right, here's the picture I was talking about. I had a weird fuel imbalance. I'd actually never seen this ICAS message before. It says fuel imbalance. Normally it'll say imbalance 2.3 or imbalance 1.4 to say that there's a lateral disparity that has exceeded some limitation. Like I think it's 6,000 pounds between the inboards and 4,000 pounds between the outboards. Anyway, it just said fuel imbalance, and the fuel synoptic page basically just showed that the outboard tanks had more fuel than the inboard tanks, just because it was due to the level that we took off with. Anyway, so I thought we also had a little bit of a balance. It's only 1,000 pounds or so. It was a little bit more than that, but between 1 and 4. So I thought, I wonder if I can feed all 4 engines from just this one tank, because it's obvious. You can see all those ICAS messages at the top. The airplane doesn't like this configuration. It's like, no, this is wrong. You need to turn all those pumps back on, right? But there is an engine-driven pump on each engine aside from these boost pumps. So that engine-driven pump is supposed to be able to provide fuel flow up to takeoff power. So I wasn't really concerned about fuel pressure starving in any of the engines. So I just thought, I'll take this opportunity to see if I can reconfigure the fuel balance. And basically that's how you balance the tanks in this airplane if you need to. You normally don't, but occasionally it will happen where you need to kind of correct an imbalance, is that you turn on the pumps from the tank that you want to decrease and turn off the pumps in the tank that has enough gas in it. So in this case, I've got 24.4 on main 4, and I want to bring it down to about 23.5, probably. Just generally a little bit closer than it is right now.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Why is your pack off? Why is pack 1 off?
Okay. Yeah, I'll get to that.
Right.
That message is always displayed in one of our airplanes, and I'll get to that in just a second. With just these 2 fuel pumps on, this tank is now the only tank providing fuel pressure to the fuel manifold. So all 4 tanks are drinking from that one tank, and then it got down to an appropriate level. Reset the fuel pumps and the cross feeds, which are there, so that we're equal level in all the tanks. Now each tank is isolated to its respective engine. So
you said all the engines are operating off of the tank?
Yeah, off of that one tank, which is again very abnormal configuration, which is why all those ICAS messages are there. We normally operate at the very least with each main tank pump two main pumps per tank operating all the time, unless the fuel tank is empty, like the center tank here. You wouldn't have those pumps on.
Okay.
So now air conditioning pressurization, which will address that pack 1 off. This is just if you need to drop the oxygen masks in the back, you can do that with this switch. Yaw damper upper and lower. These are switches we never touch. They're always on. Occasionally on the ground, there'll be some weird bug in the system, and you'll reset one of them, but it probably happened to me once. Pressurization panel here, it's all automatic. Normally we don't ever touch this panel. It's very strange that we would, although, during training once a year in the simulator, yeah, they'll give us some scenario where we'll have to manually open the outflow valves to depressurize the airplane or something like that. Or manually, if for some reason the FMC system isn't working for pressurization, then you'll manually set the landing altitude. But normally the FMC controls the pressurization system. It knows the elevation of the airport you're taking off from, the airport you're going to, and the cruise altitude that you have selected in between. So it'll manage the pressurization system completely automatically. This panel here is air conditioning, and basically just control the temperature of flight deck. Ours is a little bit different we have the main deck, forward and aft, and lower lobe. So there's 2 other rotary knobs here. But I mean, normally you just keep it like right in the middle on auto. Sometimes if you have perishable cargo, you need to set the main deck cargo system to like a really cold temperature. And then these buttons here just kind of, we don't have the recircs. Trim air is just an untreated bleed air that is used for like certain parts of the cargo area that are traditionally is not the right word, but normally cold. So it'll meter a certain amount of bleed air into that section. It's also used, trim air is also used for other like pneumatic purposes, which I forget at the moment, and it's probably pretty boring anyway. Equipment cooling down here, there's on the lower lobe of the airplane below the flight deck, where the nose wheel is, that's where all of our avionics are. And so this is just, this controls the ventilation. Normally it's in normal. Sometimes there'll be some weird fault in the system where you'll need to override it or turn it off because it's, you know, if something is smoking down there, you don't want it to let smoke into the main cabin area. Yeah, pack reset, gaspers we don't have, high flow, that's something that occasionally if you have to shut down a pack, you'll need to put the other 2 packs into high flow to maintain pressurization. Normally we don't touch it. Okay, packs. So because we're a cargo airplane and precise temperature control in certain parts of the airplane aren't really that important to us, on all of our airplanes, we have what's called a NASI mod. NASI, I think, is a company that does this modification, but basically what it is a way of shutting down it's actually one of the packs lacks an air cycle machine that conditions the air, you know, to cool or warm. So like we saw on that slide, the last slide, pack 1, in that case, it's removed from pack 1. So pack 1 is on and available, but it's not providing any control for temperature. Or it's not even on. It's just off. It's dormant. It's in a standby configuration. And what that does is it increases fuel efficiency by some like marginal percentage point. But the selling point is that first of all, it simplifies the system. So you have one less air cycle machine that you have to worry about maintaining. And the other thing is that you could, over the course of a year, maybe you're going to save, I don't know, 1,000, 3,000, 5,000 gallons of gas. Not a lot in the grand scheme, but enough to create an economic advantage. So that's why you'll see that message. On some of the airplanes, it's pack 2, that's off. But the other thing about that too is you should know which pack has the NASI mod, because if you're trying to keep the airplane cool on a hot day on the ground, having that pack turned on doesn't help you. It just makes extra noise. So now I was talking about the isolation valve. So here, as we can see, this is the isolation valve I was talking about. So I've got engines 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if I close this pack, like I was trying to start engine 4, the external air machine couldn't put enough air through this manifold to get enough spin on number 4 to get it going. So what we did was we closed this valve, which doesn't actually display very well in the schematic, but we closed this valve right here. Oh, I'm sorry, because this is the normal configuration in flight. From external, it'll come like where the APU is. So it's either APU or external air coming through this part and down through here. So with that isolation valve closed, now it doesn't have to run up here. Also, we closed this one as well. So basically all the air had to pressurize was this area right here down to engine number 3. And we got enough air pressure to spin up engine number 3, which in turn can provide the pressure to spin all the rest of the engines up for engine start. So those are the isolation valves right there that I was talking about. Any questions on that?
No, but that explained a lot. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Here's the mode control panel. These two edge panels here are just controls for each pilot's navigation display. It has individual things like you can set the barometric minimums for an approach, or the radar altimeter minimums if you're doing a Cat 2 or Cat 3 approach. Meters when you're flying in Russia or China, they give you your altitude in meters. Inches or hectopascals for local pressure. And then these are just, you know, range configuration things. And then these are the options that you can have. The only really interesting thing here is that if the radar is selected on, it's actually not even energized unless one pilot has selected this weather radar button on their navigation display. So then the radar is energized and emitting radiation. But the mode control panel here, flight directors, obviously the nice little crossbars that tell you where to point the dot and fly the airplane successfully. That's your auto throttle arm switch right there. Speed, normally for takeoff, we set this to the V2 speed, takeoff safety speed. But once VNAV starts, which usually happens around 400 feet or so, 400, 500, 600 feet, depends. But once VNAV starts, this window will blank. And now the airplane is flying its VNAV profile. So once it's hit its acceleration altitude, which is either going to be 1,000 feet or 3,000 feet, depending on what country you're in or what noise abatement procedures there are, the VNAV profile takes over, that window blanks. If you need to override VNAV with manual speed control, you press this selector knob and that opens the window back up and gives you a numeric value to use. The select button here is just to select between knots and Mach, depending on what altitude you're at. You might want to keep it in Mach, but normally that's closed. Any speed changes we do through the FMC in normal operations. This thrust button, never touch it. It just it's a way of manually controlling the thrust limit for the engines. Again, that's part of the VNAV profile. So normal operations, you don't even touch this button. I don't think I've ever used that on the line ever. Speed, again, that's for speed mode. So it prioritizes the airspeed no matter what else you're doing. We don't use that mode. We're either in VNAV or Flitch. And so yeah, LNAV, obviously lateral navigation. Normally that's based on GPS and our FMC flight plan. Magenta needles, as we would call it, although we don't even say magenta because that's the standard mode. Green needles, which would be using a VOR for guidance, lateral guidance, which I've never used in this airplane, so I wouldn't even know. But LNAV will work for either one of those, but you would have to prioritize the mode, and it would know. VNAV, this is like the primary source for all of our performance. It tells you how fast to fly, how high to fly, what speed to climb at and descend at. And it's all based off of some predetermined cost index number, like I showed you on the flight plan fuel block. So VNAV is the primary mode. The secondary mode is Flitch, flight level change, which we'll use when VNAV, either we're in like a place where we're being vectored, we're not on like a normal part of the flight plan anymore, like being vectored onto a final approach. I'd probably be in flight level change because VNAV is looking for target altitudes to efficiently move the airplane to. But sometimes I just need to get down right now at this speed to this altitude, and flight level change is perfect for that. Heading mode, pretty self-explanatory. There's a little bank angle limiter if you need it. Vertical speed, this is like the forbidden mode because our airline training department is, I think they're kind of afraid that, you know, vertical speed could potentially fly you into, it could fly you into a stall and a climb. It could fly you into a mountain or terrain and going down. It could also overspeed the airplane if that's your priority mode. So they generally don't like us using vertical speed, but there are occasions when you have to use it. Like when air traffic control tells you descend at, you know, 2,000 feet per minute or greater. If you wait for the VNAV or you try and convince the VNAV to descend at a specific rate, you'll just give yourself fits. It's not worth the trouble. Just tell the vertical speed what you need and it'll give it to you, and obviously monitor it. And it'll stop at a hard altitude that you have pre-selected here in your box. So this is one we're touching all the time, climbing and descending. This gives VNAV permission to go where it wants to go. And yeah, it's a huge part of what we do every day is changing altitudes. Localizer and approach right there, self-explanatory. The GPS approaches, RNAV approaches are flown in LNAV. Only localizers or ILSs use these two buttons. 3 autopilots on the airplane. You can use whichever one you want. The only time more than one autopilot is operating is during a coupled approach. You can do a Cat 2 auto land with only 2 autopilot, or Cat 1 auto land if you wanted to auto land Cat 1. You could do it with 2 autopilots working, but for Cat 3 you need all 3, and that's obviously for the redundancy. This is the autopilot disengage bar. Never touch it because it's like you pull it down and it stays down. You can't re-engage the autopilot. We disconnect the autopilot with the buttons on the yoke. And then this panel right here just covers the lower ICAST, the synoptic pages. So, you know, some of the system pages that you just saw in the previous slides already, and then there's a couple more up ahead. Are there any questions on the mode control panel, autopilot?
I'm good on that.
Okay. Throttle quadrant and engine pages. There's no physical trim wheel in the cockpit, probably like the Airbus. So we just have a trim indicator on either side because you know both pilots can't see the opposite one. So the green band indicates the takeoff safety band. If you try and take off with the trim set outside that green band, an alarm will go off. Speed brakes, throttles, flap selector. Normally takeoff flaps 10 or 20 and land with either 20 or 25 or 30. Those are the fuel control switches right there, run and cut off. Pretty basic.
What determines a flaps 25 or 30 landing?
Well, 25 or 30 would be, so 30 is really probably the preferred landing because it's a lower approach speed, and that does 2 things for you. Obviously, it shortens your ground roll because you have less momentum to slow down. But it can save you a little bit of brake wear just because it's less inertia, less energy you're using the brakes to arrest. So, but 25 gives you a little bit better feel. It's easier to land smoothly, I would say, in 25, although it's not really that hard in flaps 30 either. It's not much of a difference, but contaminated runways, so wet or, you know, icy, whatever, you're always going to land flaps 30. That's the mandate because you want the lower energy and, you know, just as much as you can reduce the landing roll on a contaminated surface. So we always use flaps 30 for contaminated runways. Because there's no trim wheel, physical trim wheel, these are the stab trim switches cutouts right here. So if you were to have a runaway trim situation that the computer system didn't automatically stop, which it's supposed to. then the stab trim is like your emergency life preserver right there. And then this is the alternate trim. I've never had to use it even in the simulator, so but that's just an alternate source for controlling the pitch trim. That's your radar control right there, and then those are your radio tuning heads, which is only for VHF and HF. I cannot tune VORs or NDBs through these. You have to do VOR and NDB tuning through the FMC. And so on the main, the center panel here, which is above the throttle quadrant, you have the standby instruments. That just controls the ICAS. EIU is image, or I forget what EIU stands for now. I have to look that up. But over here is heading true or norm. If you're above a certain latitude, you would set this to true because magnetic north is no longer a good reference above a certain latitude. And then FMC left right, that just toggles between which FMC is the command FMC, and it's normally set to the captain's side. There's the landing gear, alternate gear extension. We also have alternate flaps here, which is, you know, something that fortunately you never had to use. So any questions there? Except don't ask me about this knob because I forget what that knob is. All right, well, this is just the secondary engine instrument display, which has the N2, the fuel flow, oil pressure, oil temperature, oil quantity, and then vibrations, which occasionally you'll see that pop up in flight. You know, they'll get some weird indication and it'll pop up like, hey, take a look at this. But haven't had an engine try and shake itself to pieces yet, fortunately. You also have the flight control surface indications. So we keep that up when we're doing our flight control check on the ground before takeoff. Make sure we have full travel. Two rudder surfaces powered by two separate hydraulic systems, outboard ailerons and inboard ailerons. The outboard ailerons, those lock at, I think, 240 knots. It's not actually printed in our manual, but around 240 knots, the rolling of the airplane is done by the high-speed ailerons, which are the little squarish looking ones that are inboard between engine 2 and 3. It's actually locked closer to engines 2 and 3, not in between the engines. But and then spoilers provide roll control as well. An elevator, you know, two separate surfaces that can operate independently, although they are actually locked together. So anyway, that's that synoptic page. We normally keep the lower ICAS screen blanked unless we're looking at something. So normally that screen is dark. And then these are the other synoptic pages. The status page, which gives you hydraulic information, APU, oxygen, and lets you know what your battery voltage is. This is one that can be very important. Brake temperatures. It tells you tire pressure too, but brake temperatures. Like normally landing in Delhi, India, it can be they put us on the short runway. We're near max landing weight, and it's hot there all the time. So it's easy to cook a brake in Delhi, the way we operate. And then the doors page. We don't have all these doors. We only have you know, the L1 door. We have a main cargo door indicator here, and then two of the lower lobe cargo doors on this side. So this is a passenger plane, obviously. And then Roderick suggested I talk about the body gear steering, which you can see in this picture. The main landing gear on the fuselage there turns with the nose wheel and aids in the turning radius of the airplane, maneuverability on the ground, which is huge because it's not an easy airplane to maneuver on the ground all the time. So it's a huge help. And then here's just a quick.
Hold on 1 second. A question here from Gerald Smith. Well, firstly, saying you're giving some great info.
Okay.
So,
yeah, I feel like I'm talking way too much, but please, yeah.
I assume that persons have been pretty attentive because it's not every day that we have a 747 captain on. But his question was, is tire pressure needed to be memorized, or is it just in the
Oh
field?
God, no. Yeah, that's one of the nice things about operating an airliner like this. Like that's not in my purview as the pilot of the airplane, the captain of the airplane. Like for me, the tire is either inflated to its correct pressure or it's not. And if it's not, then I get an ICAS indication that tells me, yeah, it's not something I would commit to memory at all. And we're not required to, so that's nice.
All right, great, thanks.
Yeah, and so this is just this is right from our manual. It explains the nose and body gear steering. They're both powered off of hydraulic system number 1, and so the tiller can turn it, which is it's a lever in the cockpit that we use to steer the nose wheel. That can turn 70 degrees in either direction, and the rudder pedals, you can steer it, but it is only up to 7 degrees with just the rudder pedals. So the body gear will operate when nose wheel steering exceeds 20 degrees, and that reduces the tire scrubbing. Obviously, there's still tire scrubbing, which you will see, 747s as they turn onto runways, you can see where they've left their tire marks just from the turn. So it's activated when we decrease through 15 knots, and it deactivates accelerating through 20 knots. So that's an alarm we can get to for the takeoff configuration. If you apply takeoff power and the body gear isn't centered, it'll give you an alarm, say don't continue, stop and figure out if you can center the body gear. So, but we can fly without the body gear steering. And it just limits our turning radius we go from 153 feet to 173 feet. So it's not huge in the grand scheme of things, but it does provide you a little bit of extra maneuverability, and obviously it increases the life of the tires, so because they're not scrubbing against the pavement so badly. And then I thought maybe this would be of interest to you guys. This is just the minimum equipment list thing related to body gear steering. So, it's on the C interval, which tells you how long you can go with it deferred. There's 1 installed on the airplane, and there's 0 required. So you don't have to have it to fly. And this tells you that maintenance has a procedure that they have to comply with before the system can be deferred. And then the O, that's for the pilots, that's the operational procedure. And then there's just like a brief description here. You have to verify that the body gear steering actuators are locked and the body gear steering is deactivated. And then all it tells you from an operational standpoint is that turning capability will be reduced. And I like this next sentence, because do not attempt to make a turn away from an obstruction within 11 feet of the wingtip or within 59 feet of the flight deck. I have no idea how far 11 feet is from the wingtip sitting in the left seat of the airplane. So it's one of those little amusing anecdotes that pops up every now and then, like, how could I possibly know that? But anyway, and then this is the last slide here. This is just the rest of the center pedestal. We have this computer here is the ACARS computer. It doesn't serve any FMC function. It's strictly for getting ACARS data, sending messages to the company. Also, it's our interface for the sat phones. And we can get PDC clearances through this. We normally get our oceanic clearances through this. That's the third VHF comm panel, the observer's radio transponder here, auto brake selector, rudder trim, aileron trim. There's no aileron trim indicator like we have for the pitch or the rudder. The aileron trim indicator is the yoke. There's a little inscription on the top of the yoke that kind of indicates, where you are on aileron trim. So, and then these things here, we just have the no smoking and seatbelt sign. We don't have the flight deck door lock or the flight attendant advisory, or this is a call system for flight attendants. We don't have that. And we have a printer right here to print waste more paper. So that's it. That's all I got. So I'm happy to take as many questions as you guys have.
All right.
We have a question in the chat from Gerald again. He's asking, does the 747 does 100 or 200-hour inspections I don't understand. Can you see the chat? Does the 747 does 100-hour, 200-hour inspections or is it just A, B, C, and D checks? Question 2, when do you use auto brakes 3, 4, and max?
Okay, well, there is a regular inspection interval. We do A, B, C, and D inspections. There's also daily inspections. We have mechanic flying on our planes most of the time. So there's a daily interval and a weekly tech interval that it involves, various things. Daily things are like fluid levels, tire pressures, brake wear, stuff like that. And then the weekly involves a little bit more advanced stuff that I'm actually not 100% sure of. But no, we don't do, there's no 100-hour, 200-hour maintenance schedule that I'm aware of. Now, the auto brakes, so for takeoff, it's always an RTO. That's essentially max braking. The disarm, that's just if you wanted to manually disarm it, which occasionally we do on the runway, but it's easier just to kind of tap the brakes a little bit and then that'll disarm the system. We never use auto brakes 1. Auto brakes 2 is for dry runways that can accommodate the deceleration rate of auto brakes 2. Sometimes it'll be landing on a dry runway, but because of the length of the runway and the weight of the airplane, the solution that comes back from the ACARS performance will say we'll have auto brakes 2 blanked. It'll just say it'll have dashes in the auto brakes 2 setting, letting you know that that's not an option because it's not enough deceleration for the runway and the weight. 3 and 4 would be for contaminated runways. So anytime, even if I'm landing on a 13,000-foot runway in an empty airplane, procedurally, we're still supposed to use flaps 30, auto brakes 3. Now, in practice, you can kind of use your practical experience to say, I think auto brakes 2 will deliver plenty of stopping power because we weigh only 500,000 pounds and the runway is 13,000 feet long. Of course, if you do make that decision for yourself, you have to be able to back it up. If the airplane does end up sliding off the runway, you have to be able to justify the decision, obviously. But procedurally, they just want you to default to the auto brakes 3 anytime the runway is contaminated. Yeah, and then sometimes you will see 4. Like when I was going into Chicago last winter and I had to divert, the shorter runways performance solution was saying that I had to use auto brakes 4, which did make me a little bit nervous, but I do know that those performance numbers that we get from ACARS have a heavy margin on them. So it's not really, too bad. But max, I've never used auto brakes max. I've never seen it required in any operation that we do. So,
How
yeah,
intense is max?
anytime I would have to use max, I'd be a little concerned and maybe even consider diverting. But
If you use auto brakes max, so the second you turn the weights on wheel sensor will it like jolt you forward? Are the brakes like really strong?
yeah, so max, so the 1, 2, 3, and 4 operate on a scheduled deceleration rate. So it's like X many knots per second. I don't know what it is. They never even made us learn that. I don't think it's printed in any of our manuals. But RTO and max, those are both just everything that the brakes can give to you before locking up. That's not even, it's not a rate anymore. It's just everything I've got. I'm going to give it to you.
Interesting. That sounds. So you would never actually use max, though.
It would be really strange to have to use max. Like if the runway was requiring you to use max, you would probably want to question why you're trying to put the airplane on that runway. Now, look, if I'm over the middle of the Pacific Ocean and I've got a fire indication inside the airplane, and I've got to try and put it down on like Midway Island, and you know, it's telling me max auto brake. Well, yeah, we're going to use max auto brakes and hope for the best. But like, if I'm over the continental United States or Europe, and it's telling me, oh, if you want to land on this runway, you're going to need to use auto brakes, max auto brakes. Then I'd probably call contact the company, you know, call them on the sat phone or send them an ACARS text and say, hey, you know, ACARS performance is telling us that we have to use max for this runway. You really want us to put the airplane there, or would you rather us take it someplace else with a more accommodating runway? You know, take that like liability decision out of your own hands, and you know, let somebody higher up the pay scale make the decision for you.
Mm-hmm. I see. That's interesting.
All right, guys. So, if there's any more questions, we can take just one more. So if you guys have any questions, you can let me hear them right now. Nope. All right. Well, we'd like to thank Stephen for this very detailed presentation. I said to the guys, after this meeting, I can take a 747 and do a few.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you got that new flight simulator coming out now, so.
Yes. So we'd like to thank you for taking the time out to do this presentation and present it to us. I said to Demar, hopefully Ceylon, the reward for a good job is always more work, so we'll talk.
Yeah.
So I'd like to thank everyone for logging on and staying for the meeting. Hopefully you guys learned a lot and really enjoyed yourselves. So we will be back again next 2 weeks for another very informative meeting. And just stay tuned, and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, if anyone does have any follow-up questions, if they send them to Roderick, he has my direct contact, and I can try and get the answer back to you. So.
Yes, yeah, guys. If you have any questions, you can forward it to me. I think your IG handle is on or fly on Instagram. So, I mean, if you guys want to message him on Instagram also, I'm sure he's open for that, correct?
Sure.
Alrighty, great. So, I see Demar saying, it was an awesome meeting, and thanks for all the information.
All right. Well, if Demar thinks it was good enough, then I'll consider it a success, because he did set the bar really high. So I appreciate it.
Alrighty. Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Take care, everyone.